maybe what we can do is have you, T, introduce yourself a little bit. Um, where you're in Utah, right? Is that
Yep,
correct?
Utah.
Yeah. So where you're coming from, you are well, I'm a former academic, so you're a sort of fellow academic. And I'd love to hear a little bit about what brought you to writing this book, perhaps, and then I can start with a few, questions to get us warmed up, and we can dive in from there.
Great. Um, I am Thi Nguyen. I'm a philosophy professor at the University of Utah. I have some weird specialties. There was a long time when I didn't actually know what united everything I was working on. I was working a lot in the philosophy of art and this weird project on the nature of games. And I was also working on how social communication happened, especially how things like social media networking platforms changed the shape of communication. I couldn't figure out what the connection was. And a fellow philosopher who's doing my junior review, Brandon Cook, he wrote in my file that my interests, though diverse, made perfect sense because I was interested in how external social and technological structures transformed how we thought and how we valued. And I think that's basically right. That's what I'm interested in. My first academic book, Games, Agency as Art, was trying to really understand the nature of games as a social technology. And I was particularly interested in how people who praised games were really interested in them. They tended to revert to theories of games as a kind of cinema, right? Like video games are beautiful because they have good dialogue and all this stuff. And they weren't interested in the things that I was really interested in, which is the way in which games changed how we acted and how we desired. And so the theory from that book was that games were a particular art form that worked in the medium of agency itself, that it transformed who we were. And a crucial part of this was it transformed our goals in the setting by specifying a point system. So I had this theory that games were beautiful because point systems transformed us into new kinds of play. At the same time, I was working on something I was calling value capture, which is when your values, when you have kind of rich, subtle, complicated values and you get put in an institution next to clear, simple metrics, and those take over. And I realized half of what I was saying was why scoring systems were beautiful, glorious, and freeing. And half of what I was saying was about how scoring systems were deadening, missed what was important, and desensitizing. And I needed to explain to myself why the same looking system could seem so different. So I ended up writing a book. The book repeats a lot of my earlier theory about games, about the fluid nature of our agency in games, and adds a new theory about the specific nature of scoring systems in a bureaucracy and why the way in which bureaucratic metrics systematically miss certain kinds of human value and certain kinds of human life. And so that's what I've been working on, and the book has a weird answer to all of that.
Love it. Thank you. There are so many places I want to go with just even with the introduction, but um, let me do a really quick, brief introduction of myself, just so that we know why we were paired up by the interintellect goddesses. So I, for a long time, was an academic, and I still spend about 25% of my time as an industry professor. And the last decade of that time was spent developing with young people for them games for mental health and well-being. And so the power of games to capture and inspire and motivate and bring to light agency that young people don't necessarily feel in their everyday lives and most definitely feel in games was part of what completely intrigued me about them as a potential conduit for behavioral and emotional change in particular, but for the good, not for the bad. So the idea was to take hold of the mechanics of some of these games. And since they were considered so effective for some of these huge lists of negative behaviors, why not design for the positive ones as well? And so we've done a bunch of work in my lab around how games indeed engage young people, hold them in that engagement, provide them with a sense of empowerment, and then as they're learning, they're also applying some of the skills that are otherwise very difficult to teach them in conventional intervention programs, for example, in school, things like emotion regulation strategies to regulate their anxiety, for example. So to me, this idea of games being a potential engine of change and using agency in this way, and using art in particular and design to delight young people so that instead of coercing them into learning whatever we consider good habits, they're actually happy to learn these, right? And so I think that first half of your thesis has always been just so inspiring to me, and what we can do with art, and this idea of using art for this kind of grasping agency and allowing people to create their own ways of being through that through games is just been intriguing to me. So I wanted to maybe dive into that first. And I really appreciate your honesty around thinking about how you have these two kind of opposing theses that you had to kind of bring together. And I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about value capture, a little bit more, so that everybody's on the same page. I mean, it
Right.
was definitely early on in your book, and it was really important. Let me just take a look at somebody else.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, so uh I started thinking about this in particular because of a gut feel that I loved games in the sense of what I would call like genuine play, but I was also very creeped out by some gamifications.
Mhm.
And so certain of the a lot of the gamifications I was looking at in particular seem to use the mechanics of games to motivationally invade people and get them hyper motivated towards a preset target. Um, so value capture is a case. It's kind of an encapsulation of the case that I'm most worried about. So I think here a characteristic case of play is choice of games under reflective control. So you play a game and then you feel out what that game does to you, how it changes. And by the way, I just want to say that I have a very broad definition of games. Games includes video games, sports, rock climbing. I'm a rock climber. Fly fishing. I think for many people, gardening is a game. The definition of game I'm working with is Bernard Suita's definition, which is that a game is voluntarily taking on unnecessary obstacles to create the experience of struggling against them. And there's already a hint of the difference between that and value capture, voluntariness. I think in particular for suits, it's really important that we choose the constraints we set on people. So for me, uh, introducing into a classroom a gamification that included where I forced my students to have level ups and experience points to increasingly motivate them towards a target I set inside an inescapable constraint system, that doesn't count as a game in the in Suits' sense. And I think that's really, really important for thinking about the value of games. So, so value capture, one of my first ideas for value capture was that the problem was that someone was inserting values into your self without against your will. And I'd say this was wrong. The reason it's wrong is because there are plenty of examples that I worry about that are highly voluntary. So by Fitbit, by Duolingo, right? You sign on to these things. And I started thinking a better analogy would be something like that value capture is outsourcing your values. And outsourcing is often consensual. We often do it on purpose. And what we're doing in many of these technologies like Fitbit and Duolingo are kind of add-ons to the will. You're buying them to get yourself to motivated by something. And but the worry is that they're kind of prefabricated will extensions. They motivate you, but only towards a preset target. And so I was really interested in the kinds of targets that showed up in metrics. So a lot of the book has become about something I'm calling the gap. And the gap is the distance between what's easily to measure in the institutional case and what's important, like the gap between lifespan and quality of life, the gap between standard learning outcomes like graduation rate, graduation speed, standardized test performance, and actual like wisdom, learning, virtue, education. And so one of the worries about value capture for me is that there's a systematic way in which we are admitting into our value system a value that has been formatted for the institutional setting. And I can give a lot more of this account, but a quick version of this is something I learned from Theodore Porter, historian of quantification culture and a historian of science, who says that institutional quantifications are designed informational units that are intentionally decontextualized because rich qualitative information travels badly between contexts because it requires lots of shared background knowledge. So, for in my case, this is like writing qualitative responses to my students, multidimensional, open-ended. Institutional quantification, think grade point average, letter grades, um, removes all the openness, open texture, multidimensionality, and subtlety and institutes a single fixed sense of meaning that's held rigid across scale. And that's what enables it to cross readily. So Porter calls this engineered traveling or engineered portability. So one thing you get out of Porter is this view, this terrifying view, just about metrics. That the thing that makes metrics easy to communicate and socially powerful is precisely the design feature that they have had high context, high sensitivity removed from them. So one of the things that Porter, I think, teaches me is that it's not an accident that some metrics are bad. It's that there's a characteristic to metrics such that they're very good at picking up on certain kinds of things, lifespan, graduation rate, things that are easily counted by anybody, and very bad at picking up on anything on purpose, bad at picking up on anything that requires high sensitivity and experience to understand. And one worry about value capture is that you're ingesting into your core value set a method of evaluation. You're letting yourself be guided with a methodology for evaluation that has been specifically designed and formatted to have high context, high sensitivity removed from the evaluative system.
Yes. You went deep really early then. And here's the thing then that I care deeply about our young people who are in either games or worse, much worse, the things that look like games, like social media that use the metrics that you talk about. And one of the things that I was most compelled in terms of what you're investigating or wanting to question deeply, because part of the thing that I kept saying when we were designing our games is we're not doing gamification. If they're not delighted, if they're not picking it up, if they're not choosing their own goals, if they're not designing their own pathways, then I don't want to think about gamification. It shouldn't be gamification. It should be fun and somewhat co-creative. And what you're talking about, I worry about because in this world, a kid is raised with the gold stars, right? With the grades, with the standardized tests from an early age. And they grow into capitalism. They grow into adults optimizing for things like followers or salary or citations in our cases, right? And so, how are we going to be reclaiming our own values, right? Outside of this value capture context, like what authentic values are there to reclaim if there isn't any kind of pre-metric self to go back to go towards, right? Where do we find these intrinsic values if we're being brought up already in a system that's at least two generations been thinking about this kind of optimization and metrics in this way?
First, I just want to protest. I don't know why you're focusing on children. I mean, what we're talking
Oh,
about
I
is
mean, young adults.
large scale. Now we're talking about key performance indicators. We're talking about, as I brought up, transparency metrics. We're talking about productivity ratings. We're talking about, in my case, citation rates. There's the thing that I'm talking about is not a process confined to children. It's about large scale responsiveness to large institutional measures. And I came into this thinking I was thinking about a narrow thing called gamification that was about 20 years old, and I've come out thinking that this is a large scale bureaucratization that's about that we're at the end of a 1,000-year process of movement towards unified scaled data. There's a comment from Esther that I think is really important in the chat about how important transparency is for metrics, and I think this is the thing. Uh, I came into this project thinking, oh, metrics bad, squash humanity. And that is naive. I think what actually happens is that metrics are objective in the sense that they are easily accessible by everybody, and simultaneously context squashing. And those two things happen simultaneously. So one of the papers that led to this book was a paper I wrote called Transparency is Surveillance. Uh, I was inspired by philosopher Onara O'Neill, who has this wild line that I just had never confronted before, where she says in a book about trust, um, she says, people think transparency leads to trust, but transparency asks experts to explain themselves to non-experts, and they can't because of the intrinsic nature of expertise. And so they have to invent false reasons and deceive. I think that's actually another way to put it is that uh, a transparency metric over, let's say, some set of experts that are, let's say, I don't know, it's a bunch of philosophy teachers. Maybe they're bullshitters. Maybe they're great, right? A transparency metric is something that forces a method of evaluation that that is accessible to everyone. So it simultaneously exposes corruption and bias and accountability, but it does so by binding people to a system of value and a system of evaluation that's accessible everywhere. So one way to put it is I think there's this huge trade-off between trusting experts to do what they are highly capable of doing and understanding what people can't, and the process by which we force experts, and by experts, I just mean anyone that's sensitive to anything, right? Experts to rule themselves with a metric that's being made to be instantly accessible to all. So that the nauseating position for me, the thing that I've talked myself into, is the view that this is an essential conflict that is irresolvable, and that one mistake, is just to think that we win by maxing out transparency. Esther, you use the word trade-off, and I think that's exactly the right way to put it. There's a trade-off between excessive. I mean, it's in the downside of accessibility is the removal of sensitivity. You can see that in metrics, and I think that's essential to the functioning. And what we're talking about is a tension between what's difficult, rich, and nuanced to understand, and the drive to make things accessible, precisely because some people who claim to be doing something subtle and nuanced are corrupt, bullshit, biased, right? So that's the trap that I think is really painful when you're thinking about large scale data transmission, right? It's not that it's false, it's truly capturing one particular set of things while simultaneously directing attention away from other things that require high sensitivity, high context to notice.
And my specific example, maybe this will help to like give some context, but I worked in housing, affordable housing. I underwrote affordable housing projects, and we would have funding rounds where we would distribute funding to developers who are building. So it's like a public-private partnership. And we needed to create a scoring system to divvy up the funds. And that was to be transparent about how we were allocating funds. We weren't just picking our favorite developers, right? We had to have
Yep.
criteria for, you know, what, and then along with that came compliance rules and metrics and all sorts of things. So I think to your point, like if you don't have that, then you really don't have transparency. Like I don't know, I don't see a world where we have these government programs where we distribute funding and we're not transparent about how we're picking who gets funding, you know.
Uh,
But I also like think that the subjectivity and context is important, and the metrics will never, the scoring will never, you know, be perfect. It will never capture what it needs to capture. But the idea is that you try to create these programs, tweak them based on, are we getting the projects we really need year by year? Maybe we're seeing we need to change the scoring a little bit because we need more funding to go to this part of the state, that kind of stuff, you know? Does that make sense?
yeah, I mean, I the thing I worry about is thinking that governance is unimaginable without transparency, without transparency is the final driver. And again, I'm not saying that it's bad, right? I'm saying it's a high cost, powerful and high, it's a very powerful and very high cost system. I think there is a, there's an example that I became obsessed with. Do you know the history of Charity Navigator and the throughput rating? So Charity Navigator's move was to think, oh, there are all these charities that let me tell you a quick story first. So this is from Jennifer Lena, who's a sociologist of music. It was about how in an early era of the NEA, a lot of the grants were given to groundbreaking artists, and then the NEA got accused of nepotism and you know not and giving things to their friends. And so the response was to put in a kind of measure that was accessible to everyone that didn't require someone to say, let's trust us in our little artistic expert world. And the ones they used at first were box office receipts. I think this is a little vivid. It's a toy example, but it's a really intense example of the diffs, the highly expert, high trust, highly corruptible procedure, and the highly accessible, highly accountable, low sensitivity procedure. My favorite example is Charity Navigator. So Charity Navigator wanted to bring transparency to a lot of nonprofits that were operating with low transparency. It had been operating with low transparency for a really long time. And so they wanted an objective metric, and what they used was the throughput rating. So the throughput rating is how many of your donations go that are given to that nonprofit come out the other side. Turns out it's a really bad metric. It forces nonprofits to race to cut internal costs, which means they can't hire experts, they can't hire internal salaries. And it's this very clear image in which is convincing to outsiders like me for a long time of nonprofits as like funnels for money and not like places where you have to make complex decisions. And I think one way I've started to explain it to myself is that if you want to actually assess whether a specific, say, housing nonprofit offering in a particular part of the world, whether it's doing well, you need to know a lot about that part of the world, about housing, about how housing works in that part of the world. But that's not easily extractable. What is easily extractable is accounting. So accounting works the same in every nonprofit. And so throughput is a kind of thing that can be assessed using the same method on every nonprofit. It requires a kind of cross-cutting expertise instead of a specific expertise, but it just identifies the wrong thing. So I don't I I think there is a high use for transparency, but also that the presumption that we need intense transparency all the time radically underestimates the costs and the large scale desensitizing impact.
I agree. I also think, though, at least when you're talking about government, it's demanded
Yeah.
from the public. So there's always going to be that tension.
Yeah. I mean, I'll tell you what transparency looks like right now in my university. They're cutting funding to ethics programs because what the transparent measure is how quickly people get through and get a job. And if you insert ethics programs, people don't get jobs as quickly because they become worried about what certain companies are doing. And I think like I don't have a better like but I also think that there is an argument that large scale institutions cannot work except with metrics, right? That what you need are cross-cutting coordinating measures to put together large scale institutions. And now we have this weird place where we have to live in a world in which we need large scale institutions. We know that are reliant on highly decontextualized information, and then we have to somehow live.
It's interesting because we landed on this conversation around transparency, and there's philanthropy. Like philanthropy is broken by most people's standards and the ways that they think about evaluating value, essentially, outside of any kind of quantifiable. It has more to do with relationships and has more to do. So it's an interesting conversation that's gone into transparency only that I think is important. I wondered if anyone else had anything to contribute around this transparency issue, and there's a few more I think that the book brings up that we can move to as well.
Or if it's depressing, we can talk about play.
Pardon?
Or if that's too depressing, we can talk about play.
Well, I mean, I think it's relevant to all of these. Mary, yeah.
I just want to say, I think someone said it in the chat as well, that in healthcare, we often measure the wrong things. And so we can either look really good or really bad, but we're not actually answering the right question.
Yeah. I mean, I totally agree. And healthcare is a really interesting case for me. Um, I the the so one thought some people have is, well, the metrics we have are bad, let's build better ones. Another suspicion that I've been chasing for a long time is that some things don't metrify and that the demand for metrification will miss certain things. There's a beautiful argument. It's from Elizabeth Barnes, who's a philosopher, metaphysician, about why health doesn't metrify. I mean, by the way, in the end of my book, I was looking for an argument, and I just quote her because she's got it. So one of the things she thinks is that there are many concepts. Philosophers of language have this idea of uh, highly context sensitive concepts. So something like tall. What tall means is, you know, depends on your context class, right? Like I am tall for a Vietnamese person. I am medium for an American, and I am short for a basketball player, right? She thinks a lot of terms are in particular interest sensitive. So, and she thinks health is one of these terms. So she has this fabulous example of whether a healthy knee, what makes a healthy knee. And she says, like an Olympian, like a 20-year-old Olympian, the idea of a healthy knee involves high, short term, extraordinary functionality with a willingness to trade off in the long term. Other people's idea might be low short term functionality, high long term, low pain functionality. If the concept of health is interest relative, then it's not going to be something that we can count reliably with a context cross-cutting methodology. And it's weird because I think people expect that everything important is countable in a metrified way. But if this is right, then we have this thing where might have to admit that many of the most important things just defy that methodology. Not everything, obviously. Many things are highly targetable with large data, scale
Yep.
data processes, but anything that looks like that, health has that feature.
So it's all relative.
Yeah, I mean, it's not relative in the sense that it's anything goes, not in that sense, right? Like it is no matter which of the way she puts it is there are certain things that are true kind of across the board, like hitting a knee with a saw is
Mm,
gonna cut across all our interests. And you might be wrong. So my interest might be in long-term longevity. And I think the way to do it is to take uh, lots and lots to drink lots of, I don't know, bone broth. I might just be wrong, right? So it's not relative in the sense of whatever you think is true, but there is a sense in which it is strongly dependent on a particular set of interests or a psychological profile that is highly variable. And one general lesson from this stuff is that cross-cutting institutional metrics are really good at targeting the kinds of things that are low variance in how we assess them, like lifespan or heart attack rates or recovery from uh, a infection. And they are not good at targeting the kinds of things that are highly contextually variable and depend heavily on interaction with particular psychological or low scale community features in the
yes.
method of evaluation.
Yep. Yeah. So true. So true. I've seen orthopedic outcome measures where the ankle reflex and the knee reflex has returned, so therefore the surgery was 100% successful, but the person still has a lot of pain.
Yeah, and that was exactly worded probably incorrectly by focusing on the developmental aspect, but that's where I was trying to get to around our kids. It's not so much about children and games, it's about the fact that if we are brought up for thousands of hundreds of years anyway, with metrics being this notion of even linearity, this of quantification being more versus less and so on, how do you break out of that to think through different models of value? And I think that your chapter 18 about who cuts up the world is really important because that's what we don't, whether it's transparent or not, who is doing the actual cutting up and what worldviews they have and so on, I think matters a lot in terms of these issues around metrics. So I'm wondering if anyone else, especially any of you who have read the book or have listened to some podcasts around the book, have come here with questions that they might want to ask right now. And they could be around games, around play about art and agency, which I really, again, love the way that you have thought about games as, yeah, agency, artful agency, basically.
Yeah, I'm just as happy to geek out about tabletop role-playing systems as I am to
Yeah,
talk about the complexities of transparency metrics.
we can do it all. Yeah, so I just wanted to open it up to those because there's quite a few of us here, and there are, I mean, part of what I really loved about the book was the varied applications that a philosophical approach to games offers us. And um I think it's really important because I think we are not aware of how much has driven our motivational systems. I think we talk very easily about the like metrics, but there's so many more subtle ways that even our leisure time has been quantified and taken from us in some ways.
I'll
I mean,
jump into the fray. I'm
yeah,
I'm curious
please.
about where agency fits in the whole value spectrum. Is agency one of those words that is similar to healthcare, where it's you want more of it, but the quality or quantity of it is very contextualized?
Um, I'm so I have a I don't know if it's a quirky use of the term, but I'm using the term in a very specific way. I've come to realize that some people think by agency, like I think in the game development world, I came to realize that people think that agency means freedom. I'm not, that's not what I mean. And also, I'm not, I don't think you should just maximize it. So, agency in the sense I'm using it is a specific notion by which you have a legal agent or a literary agent. So agency in the older sense, and I think the legal sense, is a unit that acts for reasons, right? So the point of your legal agent is that they're not acting out of their own interests, they're acting out of your interests. The reason we call Google a search agent is that it has a rational structure and it's responding to certain reasons. And my claim was not that games give you agency and that's great and the more the better. My claim was that games are the art form that structures agency and it works in the medium of agency. It changes what you do and how you do it, and it does so in a lot of different ways. And sometimes the best games are very low agency. Some games are extraordinarily high agency, but some games are about limit poker. My favorite board game designer, Rainer Knizia, has all these poker-like games where the whole point is that when it comes to your turn, you can only choose one of three hyper precise, you have a very small dimensionality of movement, and you have to somehow turn that into something that can interact with other people. So I, I'm not saying like agency, the more the better. I'm saying that specifically what games do is they modify our interests and our action landscape to produce all kinds of things. But my favorite games produce some kind of beautiful action, be it physical or mental. And uh, that's really distinctive. One of the interesting things, I think this is close to what Isabella was saying, is who's tuning the scoring system. Some games are tuned to produce fitness. Some games are tuned to produce like mental ecstasy, like a lot of my favorite game, like Portal type puzzle games. Baba is You, which is the most mind-bending video game I have ever played. You rewrite the rules of physics in the game as you go. It's unbelievable. They produce these like mental movements that are just like completely astonishing. Some of my favorite tabletop role-playing games have tuned the incentive structure to like motivate people to create backstory. And then what's interesting is that a lot of the large-scale institutional scoring systems are tuned for very different purposes. There's a lovely paper called "Making the Grade: The History of the American Marking System" that points out that a lot of people in the educational system moved away from ranked grading in the 1800s in America because they saw that it was focusing students too much on the test and not as much on learning. And then it came back, ranked grading came back in the 1850s and 60s out of an interest in some large scale employers for certifications for quickly hiring people that could be slotted into a job. So I would say that there's a scoring system whose engineering constraints and functional design are not designed either for fun or pleasure, nor for student enrichment, but for the uses of large scale employers that want to guarantee quick hireability to slot someone into a system. I'm sorry, maybe that wandered way too far from.
Although, again, interestingly, the other side of that, including IQ tests and things like that, is there were a bunch of people starting those because they wanted to
Right,
decrease the bias of like projected race, all sorts of
right,
racism and other kinds
yeah,
of biases. And so if we had a number, it was going to be a glorified, modernities, gold
right.
star and all that. So I think that's also really interesting to just keep thinking what might be.
Yeah, there's all these, even the best. So, Sally Engelmary, who's a anthropologist who studies quantification culture, even in a book that is mostly about how large scale, say, UN type global development metrics miss things, she starts by saying, but also we have to note that every single early diversification effort started with being like, look, you have to count the number of men and women, you have to count the number of white people and non-white people, and it's so clear if you actually count. The bluntness of that hammer is what does the work. And then one of the interesting things about the diversity case is a really interesting one because early in early in the history of diversity efforts, many people said, look, we're going to do a count of how many people there are, but what we should absolutely cannot do is turn diversity efforts into a simple quota filling. Please, God, don't let it be that. And then 3 generations down the line, what you get are diversity efforts that are quota filling. And there's something in there about the most power of the simple blunt number to actually affect brute social change, and then the kind of like magnetism of it in the long term that is that's a central part of this story.
Yes. I could jump into with a bunch of other questions, but I would really love to hear from all of you. Either in the chat, you can drop a question in if you'd like, just in the chat if you don't want to say anything, and you certainly don't have to be on video to ask a question if you just want to. Oh, John, go for it.
Hello. I'm thinking about a situation in which the the people who are playing what's ostensibly a game, uh, if their incentives are not just if uh, their incentives constrain how voluntarily they're taking on the constraints, and
Yeah,
they're not doing it just for the
right.
experience of overcoming them.
Yeah,
I'm
yeah,
thinking, like, for example, if employers have requested this ranked grading, or if
right.
a Soviet chess player, an East German Olympian, or somebody in the U.S. whose best chance of good career is professional sports. Um, in that case, who's playing the game?
Right. There's a quick way and a complicated way to answer the question. The quick way is just to like look, if it's a game, games under this account are by definition voluntary. Like what Suits thinks that what a game is voluntarily taking on obstacles to create a particular experience. Um, and if you're forcing someone to do this thing on pain of death, that's not a game anymore. It's game-like in certain ways. It's a rule structure, but it's now a kind of authoritarian government, right? Like if the essence of games is voluntariness, and in particular, right, that's one way to put it. There's a slightly subtler way that comes from Bernard Suits. So Suits thinks that the essential thing about games is that in a game, the constraints constitute the goal. This is the subtler way he is of putting it. So what he means is, um, the goal of running a marathon is to cross the finish line. If you just get to that point by any means necessary, like a taxi, that doesn't count as crossing the finish line. If you make a basket at a basketball court, sorry, if you go to a basketball court with a step ladder and pass the ball through the net, that doesn't count as making a basket, right?
Hmm.
So that's what a game is for suits. That's the
Yeah.
full version. It's constraint constituted. Now there are a lot of reasons
Yes.
you might that shows us that why we engage in the game is essentially related to a particular method. It's not just about getting the ball through the net, it's doing it in a particular way. Now then he says there you can also interact with a game as work or play. He thinks
Hmm.
to interact with it as work, and this is funky because by the way, I should say, this is geeking out a bit. In the original definition of games, suits the, the playing a game is voluntarily taking on unnecessary obstacles. That's what he
Yeah.
says is the short version, and then he gives you this full version. It doesn't use the term voluntary at all.
Uh-huh.
It's funky. He said so if someone is playing chess and they have to do it that way, and it's their only way to survive, to make money, or someone's
Yes.
holding a gun to their head, it's a
Or like a
game.
gladiatorial
Yeah,
game.
exactly. It's a game, but it's not
Yeah.
play. It's a work,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
And I think that's really important. So
Yeah.
the crucial concept here is actually not game, it's play. And
Uh-huh.
what play is then is engaging in the system for the purpose of the activity itself. Suits actually has this wildly funky definition of play. What he
Mm.
says is that play is redirecting normally useful resources into non-use in redirecting normally instrumentally useful resources into
Hmm.
wasteful activity for its own sake. It's like a wild
Hmm.
definition.
I like that.
Maria Lagones has a different definition of play, where she says what play is transitioning lightly between different rule landscapes, different worlds. And I think I mean, because I think Suits is he was really paying attention to the fact that you could be playing a game because it was your
Yeah.
only way to make money and survive, and that's really important
Right.
to model. So the
Yeah.
crucial concept for a lot of this stuff is that a lot of these systems are game or game-like, and that there's certain ecosystems that encourage play and certain ecosystems that lock us in. And
Mm.
that's it. What's important is not whether it's technically a game or not. It's whether
Yeah.
the larger ecosystem locks us into a rule set or gives us some degrees of freedom about the rule set.
So, so let's talk about why that matters.
Yeah.
So, why does this definition of play matter? Because I do think actually it matters a great deal. And there's a question here about, so how do we think about animal learning?
Right.
Or sorry, animal play?
Right.
What's the function? And again, going back to my question, I would posit that a lot of us have lost the ability and the propensity and the inclination to play because again, capitalist particular bends are it's superfluous, it's not serious business and it won't get us the money and so on. So you're making this distinction between serious, you have to do this because your life or your livelihood depends on it versus play. Tell me why play matters to you.
Play, I mean, first of all, I should say this is the qualification from the philosopher. I don't have a definition of play that I actually believe in. All of them are close to the topic, and I think there's actually just a cluster here. The interesting thing is in the Suits definition, the opposite of play is work, and for the Laguna's definition, the opposite of play is dogmatism, right? It's being stuck in a landscape, right? So it's super interesting. Why play is important. There's so many reasons, but I want to say one of the things I find the most frustrating is uh, reading accounts of play where the value of play always has to be justified from some down the line work outcome. Like play is valuable because it teaches you grit. Play is valuable because it develops skills. Like at the end of Suits' Grasshopper, he has an argument that games are the meaning of life. Playing games are the meaning of life. And the argument is, the short version of the argument is, in utopia, imagine utopia where we've solved all our practical problems. What would we do with our time? We would play games or we would be bored out of our minds. So games must be the purpose of life. A lot of people hate this argument, but it's an argument that in some ways is just openly cribbed from Aristotle. Suits was an Aristotle scholar. And what Aristotle thinks is that meaning comes from activity, from the rich deployment of our capacities. And that what it actually makes a meaningful life. When you make stuff, that stuff only pays out in value if it helps you do and be engaged in meaningful action and process, right? So, one way to put it is that I mean, I'll make the big step. I've come to think that like the factory world is the world in which the thing that has value is the kind of portable outcome. And in the Aristotelian landscape, the outcome, the product, the thing we make is only valuable if it inspires or supports interesting activity. Um, and play, for me, if this is right, if what play means, okay, let me try it. I had a student, and let me tell you about my favorite teaching moment of all time. Okay, I had a student, um, and when I gave suit and I gave this meaning of life argument, she was so angry. She hated it. It was like the most. She's like, "What about product?" She's like, she was pre med. This is like completely disgusting to her that the idea that the meaning of life would be play. And at the end of the class, she was like, "Okay, we're doing a review, and we're talking about these theories about value. One of the theories of value of life comes from Aristotle that what's valuable is difficult activity that engages your capacities. And the other view is Kant, which is what's valuable is whatever you choose freely, right? You just get to decide." And she was, same student was like, "Hey, I believe in both these views. Is there any way to synthesize them?" And I was like, "Yeah, what that would look like is a view in which valuable activity was difficult activity that you voluntarily chose. What is that?" And she screams from the back of the class, "Fuck no!" And then the rest of the class collapses into laughter, which is like my highlight teaching. But in some sense, if what play is, if these people are right, and what play is the ability to move into an activity that you chose for its own sake and not because, then it is what is important. Like you don't need a further justification. You don't need to turn it into grit or work. It is the thing that is what our lives are for. That suits.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to be my psychologist self and wait to hear from anyone else. It's really easy for me and you to riff.
Yeah.
I would really love, and this is the difference between a salon and a lecture or even a class, is I'd love to hear from Kim or Clark. I know Marcus, and I'll actually pick on you um, if I don't hear from others. Swati, I haven't seen you in so long. I want to hear from you.
I demand outraged responses.
Yes, exactly. There's salons. You can think of, you don't have to have read the book, by the way. There she is. There she is. Mary, while Swathi brings her question, what would you like to throw in?
Uh, I'm just wondering how much choice do we really have? I've been reading recently about the God helmet, where you put this helmet on your head and it's got some kind of electromagnetic stimulation. And if you put it specifically on I think it's the right temporal lobe, you have this godlike experience. And now the virtual reality gaming designers are wanting to use something like that so that when you've achieved all the levels in your game and you've come to the highest point, you're going to have that little bit of stimulation so that you get this feeling that you are like God. And so, where is the choice in that?
Um, I don't know how to cope with that question. Uh,
A good
I
one.
mean, that looks to me, if you're saying is I've created a device that can take over your brain and swamp it with pleasure signals, so you have no choice. Where's the choice in that? And then I'll say, guess there's no choice in that. But that's not all games, right?
So
The
that's
whole
but that's a form of play, isn't it?
uh wait, why is me drugging you with pleasure a form of play?
No, me playing the game is a form of play.
Yeah.
And even if I'm sort of vaguely aware of maybe this moment and I choose to play the game, have I actually made that choice?
Let me back up a bit and talk about choice in games because I think it's really important. One of the features of games I think is really interesting that makes them different from metrics is that if a game is not satisfying you, you can mod it, right? Like I think it's really interesting that you cannot modify GPA. The whole point is that it's cross-cutting and stable. You can't modify page views. It's cross-cutting and stable. But if you don't like how the rules of Dungeons and Dragons, you can mod it. And if you don't like how Mario is playing, you can speed run it. This is, in the end, this is the dumb conclusion of my book. You can't house rule grades, but you can house rule Dungeons and Dragons. That's it, right? And you can house rule in really interesting ways. There's a whole incredible history of how people have modified Dungeons and Dragons to tweak it for different experiences. So I mean, there's a sense in which if someone is choosing the thing you're describing, sure, that's play. But I mean, I how about this? I am not, I worry that in many cases what we're describing are systems that have not been designed to choose a rich activity, but designed to addict us. I mean, and I'm not sure that an addictive response is genuinely a choice in response to, right?
That's a really cool answer. I'm going to think about that. Thank you.
And so even if Kim may not want to talk, I think her point is really
Okay.
important along the same lines.
Right.
Because she's talking about the idea of optimizing our whole life, right?
Yeah.
And I don't know how old she was, but it goes back to my young people's thing. If you've never known anything else,
Right.
except this kind of optimization and using points and badges and
Right.
buzzes and bings.
Yeah.
And that's what's been called, that's you've been told actually that's fun. The gold star is the fun, the winning the whatever trophy is the fun. Then you haven't done that thing that you have not talked about, which I really wanted to hear you talk about next, which is the process and not the outcome. So the thing about working, you said it was a hard thing that you work on to get to that point of winning or what or almost winning or whatever it is, right? And so I think one of the important things around the dopamine high comes only because you've worked at it for a long time and there's a liking that happens in our neural system that we're enjoying the process until we finally gain the big thing, right?
Yeah.
And these systems have shortcutted that process to such a degree that it's way too instantaneous, or at least that's where I'm wanting you to think with us about.
Yeah. I mean, look, let me I think there are two different paths to go from here. One is Kim's question, and one is your comment about being raised this entire way. And I think both are incredibly important to talk about. So and they're really related. So let me talk about both. So Kim's question is great. And I think one of the interesting things is that games make this complicated is that there is a sense in which games are optimization for fun. But the meta sense is that in genuine play, you get to choose which optimization path you're on. You don't have one forced on you, right? You can try for a while doing it one way, and then you can shift. You can try to up your mileage, and if that gets boring, you can shift to the game of trying to go to many peaks, right? Or you can start trying to. I used to climb for difficulty, and that helped me for a long time get in better touch with my body. But at some point, that started turning boring, and so I started trying to climb climbs as elegantly as possible, right? So one of the interesting things about games is there's a preset goal, and a lot of the times that preset goal is part of a beautiful design, right? Someone has made a game with a really interesting goal, and we experience it by following that goal. And second, the glory of the game happens when you plunge yourself in, and a lot of the best games are all out, like the goal is to climb the cliff. Okay, I'm doing nothing but climbing the cliff. But with genuine play, we back up and then we ask whether that system that we're optimizing in is actually valuable. We have a reflective step, right? Where we think, okay, I've been doing mileage. Is this making me happier and healthier? Like we do that thing where we make choices about the scoring system in the light of something that is outside the scoring system. The thing I think that Kim is talking about is when you let an external measure be the final decider and you don't have an external step and you're just like, well, I guess here's the system. I got to up more mileage, or here's the system. I got to crank out the most pages per day. And you accept without modification. an external scoring system rather than, I mean, DIYing the shit out of it, right? So that's one way to put it. And I think this is why is it so easy? I think this is where Isabella's question comes in. It's super, I mean, one of the things I learned from a lot of the people in the history of quantification is this general idea that when a system enters information infrastructure, it becomes we mistake it for natural and we forget that it uh, it was a product of human choice and it emphasizes certain things over other things. There's Do you all know about diurnal time? So we have one system that we use, clock time. We're all organized in Greenwich Mean Time. It used to be that we kept time. A standard way of counting time before was diurnal time, and diurnal time is where 6 a.m. is sunrise and 6 p.m. is sunset. Totally different way of keeping time. Totally different, right? Uh, Hours change in size. It doesn't coordinate well across time zones. It's bad for Zoom calls. It's incredibly good for waking up in the light and coordinating work around light and being a human animal that wakes up with the sunrise and always working in the light. It's actually really good for rural life, agrarian life. It's good. It's good for the human animal that doesn't want to wake up in the middle of the ass darkness to get your kids up to school sometimes. Um, and I think one way to put it is clock time is a decision. It makes certain kinds of life easy and certain kinds of life hard. But if you grew up in it, you don't realize it was a decision. A lot of what people are interested in is standardization. So it's really easy to assume. I mean, here's the dumbest version of the story. If you find a cup measure in someone's house that doesn't measure the standard cup, you might be, what went wrong? How did this happen? But that happens against the background of an enormous, like standardized cups is a weird, intense thing that we did, that we made. There's a huge amount of effort. And that's the thing that requires explanation. The fact that different cups are different sizes, that's normal. But then we forget that because the world has gotten standardized. And I think that's one of the things that's happened with metrics. There's a standardization of the way we evaluate things. And once it becomes sufficiently intrusive and world spanning, we forget and we think it's just natural that the thing we aim for is, and then you insert some measure that we've carefully created and held stable over time and space. Does that sort of stab at the?
Totally.
I guess the question is how do we get out of it? I don't know. I don't know.
Oh, I like it's not even like a how to. I think, first of all, awareness is one of the biggest things. Like the coolest thing about learning about history and philosophy at the same time is that you realize this is pretty much all arbitrary. We kind of made this shit up and then we built that thing on top of the thing we
Yep.
built and made up and it kept going, And I think it's fascinating. And even understanding that that's how the world works and
Yep.
reverting back to our experience and comparing it to the conceptual and that there is an experience level that is different, I think is something to think about. Swati.
Yeah.
Hello.
Hi.
Thank you. First of all, lovely salon. I'm halfway through a book, and it's lovely. It's just so dense. It's and so enjoyable. It's kind of like anyway, dessert. My question was, what would you want designers of bureaucratic systems, of metrics to do differently after they've read your book?
That's such an interesting question. And I think the answer is not quite for the designers of metrics, it's for the large scale users. I mean, I think here's a funky example. Everyone knows that BMI is a terrible way to measure yourself, but the people that made it actually knew what they were doing. So BMI was originally a large scale public health measure, and it was never designed to judge individuals. It was supposed to be a warning sign. If the BMI changes across a whole population, suddenly you know something's up. That was fine. And then suddenly a bunch of people trying to race to the bottom of BMI individually, that's the worry. And I think in many cases, a lot of the metrics we have and a lot of the measurement systems we have are perfectly good as very rough approximate proxies to coordinate around for vast efforts. The problem comes from thinking in a policy standpoint that that's all that matters. And I think that's the thing that I've become really concerned about, that the easily measurable becomes all that matters. It kind of captures large scale attention. Um, the Again, like my university has become obsessed with getting students through quickly, right? And not about things like, I don't know, making sure they're reflective or ethical. Like that's right. And there are a lot of cases where, I mean, a lot of the view is about balancing, about thinking like this measure that we know is one approximation, and then there's an enormous amount, and we need it, but there's an enormous amount of other stuff that is available to sensitive experts on the ground. And by the way, by expert, I do not mean like the official person with a PhD. I mean like the expert in hip hop is the person that soaked their life in hip hop, right? The expert in skateboarding is a person that's been skateboarding their whole life and sees the value of that. That there are, that there's a, it is like somehow to balance the view, and I think this is so hard, of the world as one in which there's a multiplicity of subtle, rich, complicated values that we don't necessarily easily see, and to balance against that, against uh, the easy digestibility of highly accessible metrics. And that, I mean, I don't know how to do that. Like that's what I want to happen, but I don't know how you achieve that.
I do. You value experience rather than concepts. You value into like you value the embodied thing, and you learn how to have enough experimentation on yourself then that these generalized concepts is not what you're taught to put all your values, even values are itself themselves abstractions, right? But there is something that we do that metrics do beautifully, which is squash that any experience. And it's not about like, so that there is something about that that I think we have really lost touch with. And, you know,
There's a distinction you might love. This is from John Dewey between recognition and perception. This is one of my favorite distinctions. It says recognition is when you categorize something and you stop once you've categorized it. In perception, categorization is the beginning of the investigation and you keep going. And I think the thing that I'm describing in the bureaucratic world is recognition and not perception. And I should say I totally agree with you. Like there are lots of things you can do as individuals. Like, I think we have names for this. This is what art and play are. They are reminders to be soaked in. I mean, the Kantian notion of what the experience of beauty is looking at things without categories, without purposes, and letting yourselves be soaked in the richness of a particular experience. We know that stuff. The thing that I'm worried about is how to instantiate it at scale in large scale bureaucracies, precisely because of the communicative power of metrics. So there's an argument at the end of my book that I wrote and that I got depressed and I sent it to all my friends and I was like, break this. And they wrote back and were like, fuck you, I'm depressed now. Here's the argument. It's called value collapse. It goes like this. Imagine there's a gap between what's really important and what's easy to measure at scale. Imagine our institutions dole out rewards, promotions, and power in response to doing well on the public metric instead of what's really important. Now imagine two populations of people. One population of people knows what the metric is just a proxy and knows there are other values, and so they won't go all out for the metric. That's population one. Imagine another population of fully value captured people who do nothing but target the metric. They're going to win, which means they're going to get the resources and rise in power. Feedback loop. What you should expect is the increase in the accumulation of power of people that decide to ignore what's important and hyper focus on the metric. So the thing I don't know what to do about is that and the large institutional scale. Sorry, that's my obsessive worry these days.
I think it's many of ours.
Yeah.
Yeah. Politics is not helping. Yes, somebody dropped McGilchrist. It isn't a salon, as Marcus knows, unless somebody drops McGilchrist. Tell us more, Esther.
I don't even know if I can do that. It's just such a beef of a book. and to be honest, I haven't gotten through all of it, but um, McGilchrist just talks about this aspect of reality that is just unquantifiable. And when even if you try to describe it, and my head is also going to language, right? This is what language is. We use language to coordinate around things. It's the map, not the territory. Um, and he talks about how, there's just things you cannot describe. There's things you cannot, when you try to describe them, they disappear and you can't quantify. And he has, I mean, he's very outspoken about this, that, and I forget, it's like left brain, right brain, like he studies the brain, and that we're way too focused on the metric side and we are not cultivating enough of this unquantifiability of reality. And it is something we can cultivate. Like it is a part of our brains that we can. And I think he goes through like the whole history of why this happened. And he does a lot of digging into art as well. So it's really juicy. Yeah, this conversation's reminded me of that book.
Yeah, I mean, but the one thing I don't believe is that, I mean, there are limitations to language, but there's a big gap between what's speakable and what's institutionally comprehensible. I mean, one way to put it is what I'm really interested in is the difference between poetry and metrics, because there are weird, odd, intense things that pass through the arts. That's what the arts are for. They're for passing these complicated, odd, subtle understandings and emotions between us, but they don't metrify. So why don't they? There's one other really useful thinker here, Lorraine Daston, that helped me understand exactly this difference in her book Rules. Have you encountered? This is an amazing book. She's an intellectual historian of science. Her early work is about how the notion of objectivity changed over time. It's amazing, and her new work is about how the notion of a rule changes over time. So she says. A lot of early notions of rules are rule as principle and rule as model. So a rule as a principle is a generalization, an abstract generalization that admits of exceptions where you need judgment and discernment to know the exceptions. So in creative writing, my example is show, don't tell, right? Good rule in general, beginner rule, not you can break it. And if you really understand the basis, the origin of the rule, you know that you can break it sometimes, right? But you can't write down all the ways to break it. It requires an active interpretation and discernment. And then she says, the newest notion, sorry, the second notion of a rule is a model, like a role model. What would Jesus do? And also requires interpretation. The third notion of a rule, she says, is an algorithm or a mechanical rule, which is meant to be applied exactly as written without discernment, right? Automatically. And then she says a thing that to me is the most interesting thing I've read in like a decade. She says, people think that mechanical rules show up with the age of computing machines, but they show up about 100 years earlier. They show up in an attempt to cheapen labor by replacing highly expert people that know exactly, like highly expert, say mathematicians, that have all this understanding of different methodologies with a table that anyone that went through high school can follow. So the driving force, what Daston suggests, the live driving force, this is like the thing I said before about the certification procedures. It's about the ability to replace workers. It's about the fungibility of workers. And so what this suggests is the problem is not language, because there are a lot of weird ass terms that are really rich that people in a community can use to describe something. Every weird community I've been in has a complex aesthetic language that you actually have to, I mean, yo-yoed or skateboarded or climbed for like a couple years to really understand, but then you can communicate. But that won't survive the demand for mechanization in this sense of being applicable easily by anybody. And so I think like that's a lot of the pressure here is not about the speakable versus the unspeakable. It's the demands of scale and bureaucracy with a highly replaceable worker set where you can't depend on a particular sensitivity or shared background. That's doing a huge amount of the work in explaining what's in and out of metrics.
So we have about 15 minutes. Anyone else like to throw in? Yeah, Marcus.
Yeah, all right. So I want to try and tie McGilchrist to Dungeons and Dragons. Uh, um, Yeah, so I play Dungeons and Dragons, and the reason why I like really enjoy that game is because like there is a set of rules, but it works as like a physics engine, right? Like it like resolves outcomes. But like when you play, um, it's very improvisational, right? So you're coming up with new ideas and you're just saying like whatever comes to mind. And the two ways these things get resolved is one, like the physics engine, which we have in our real world, we have physics. But the other ways it gets resolved is through the DM, right? So you have a judge who has like perfect knowledge and has judgment over like what ends up happening in the game. So to go back to like bureaucracy and the metrics of the state, um, um, yeah, so to like, and you were talking about judgment, right? Judgment and discernment. And um, yeah, I just feel like that is the important thing that we don't have is like people whose judgment we trust who also have like high levels of knowledge of the world. So something like speeding, right, on the highway. We set the the speed limit at whatever, 75. But like that's not the goal, right? The goal is to like not have accidents, right? So we have this like metric that's good enough, but since we don't have knowledge and we don't have judgment, um, like it just sort of works. Um, yeah, I guess there's not a question there. I'm just ranting on the two.
Speed limits are such an interesting case.
Mm,
Um, I learned something from there are two philosophers of law, Shauna Schifrin and Jeremy Waldron, and everyone takes speed limits to be the clearest case where you want mechanicity. Like, of course, everyone should needs to know what the speed limit is to know when they're breaking the law. It turns out there are some areas, and I think like New Zealand is an area that often has these, where the rule is drive appropriate to the circumstances and the weather.
mhm.
Turns out, in many circumstances, you actually get fewer accidents that way. And even though different people may judge differently, so you don't get that kind of perfect mechanical fairness, that rule, it turns out, cues people to adjust to the environment, where the rule drive 65, people just drive 65 and they don't cue to the environment. I think this is really so. Lorraine Destin has all these lovely examples I stole from my book about cooking. And I think one of the interesting things about strict recipe cooking, you use 3 cups and do that. You can depart from it, but if you follow the recipe, it's not cueing you to flex to the environment. Or weird old school recipes that are like,
A pinch.
yeah, a pinch, or even like my favorite direction that I found was um, bake the bread until it makes a nice ringing sound when knocked, which seems weird. I mean, I think what's interesting to a lot of us, that seems primitive and medieval, but it actually is a better cue of loft. And what makes it seem like fake or bad or dumb is that it hasn't been written with a highly accessible mechanical standard, even though it's actually cueing you to listen to and adapt to the thing that actually matters.
Yeah, with the with speed limits as well. Like as autonomous cars hit the roads, the laws are not designed for them whatsoever. So, like we're living in a world with laws for humans that are like we're going to start having more agents operate in that space.
Yeah, and there's a really another part of process that I think is really important is that it's also around infinite versus finite games, but this idea that the process matters so much, not because of what you get as a lesson at the end, or as even the winner or loser or status or whatever it is, but that it's cueing you to the things that are actually more important, that are context specific, that are embodied in the moment, and so on, right? That matter in that. So, like, I love this idea that the speed limit doesn't that doesn't cue you into pay attention,
Yeah.
right? So games or experiences that cue you into that versus just the raw metric matter a lot. And that I bet you we could find a lot of examples of that.
Yeah. Look, it's also interesting to me that some games cue you directly. Like a lot of my favorite role-playing games cue you to do things like you get a point if your character exposes a vulnerability. That's awesome and weird. And then there are other games that where all the directions are really specific and unsubtle, and then it pushes you in a kind of mental state that requires subtlety. For me, this is fly fishing. The rules of fly fishing are very simple and mechanical, but the actual process it pushes you through is hyper meditative, hyper observant, and hyper attentive to subtle changes in the environment. But yeah, I think the one of the things that um, when I was writing about games in the beginning, one of my theories about why people were um, obsessed with the cinematography and the script and not the actual experience of playing was that we've been captured by the sense that what matters in art is always some kind of external saleable object that can be transferred, and it can't be some internal process feel. And I'm not quite sure about why, except maybe that the thing that we call an outcome is a thing that a process makes that you can export and move around. That's what it is, right? What a product is something that it spits out that you can take out of the context of moving and take somewhere else. And there's a lot of suggestion from philosophers of technology, like Langdon Winter, that factories impose a certain way of looking on the world. And what factories impose on the world is this idea that what really matters is the stuff that comes out that you can count and stack and then shift to the next point. That's not something you do with rich, complicated processes. So yeah, I mean, there's a big theory here that like if Aristotle's right, what matters is rich and interesting processes, and we have a world that tends to de-emphasize those in favor of easy countables.
Beautiful. Reminds me also of Susan Sontag's Against Interpretation, right? This idea of just experience and without that quantification, is it a good piece of art? Is it not? Is it the critic and all of that? I think Jason's question is an interesting one to go out. What games have you found best to snap gamers out of flat recognition mode and into rich perception and experience mode? I mean, you're obviously a gamer of different types of games.
Yeah. I'm not sure it's always the game. I mean, one of the interesting tensions here is that games are really narrowing experiences where everything that matters in the game is suddenly like it's really when you climb a rock as a rock climber, everything suddenly becomes bent to the purpose of moving up, and you have a careful perceptivity, but it's in a way it's flat and practical. You suddenly all that matters in the rock is going up. But I think a lot of what matters is what's outside of the game. I mean, I had this theory from my first book that people are worried about violence in video games, but what we should actually be worried about is people taking out the attitude of optimization to make the number go up is the only important thing, and you can do anything you can to make the number go up. And the real worry about games is not that they would make serial killers, but that they would make Wall Street financiers who just bent the world to make their profits go up. And I think what matters there is not the particular game, but glad you all are happy with that comment. What matters there is not the particular game, but the relationship you have with them. Whether you are being like, well, all I need to do is win this game, and then I leave the world, I'm just win, versus this other relationship of being like, the game is not what matters. What matters is something larger and richer behind the game, and I think there are a lot of an ecosystem to be like, your goal is to win, do whatever it takes to win, be the top football player, be the top chess player. That doesn't encourage that kind of reflectiveness. A different environment, the environment I found on Board Game Geek, where people are just like multi-dimensionally analyzing games in all kinds of different ways and being like, oh, this one is rich, like the world of indie tabletop role playing, where people are like, well, I like Dungeons and Dragons, but I don't, because it just is about killing and shopping. So I'm going to create a rule set that's about like inventing weird psychological drama, right? The attitude of richness and modifiability of games and of thinking about what the scoring systems are giving you, that seems to be the thing. So I mean, for me, it might be more of the social scaffolding around the game than anything in the game itself. Like games are often by nature narrowed, and then there's a question of whether the social environment triggers you to step back from that narrowness or whether it asks you to stay in that narrowness.
And I wonder if you think that variability matters, right? Because
No.
part of the thing that playing many games, so Dungeons and Dragons to me was a portal to teach my children how to recite poetry because they couldn't get into the damn cave until they recited
Right.
Rock, right, in a very certain way, and so on. And so, but then they realized, holy shit, this is a mechanic, and that's a mechanic, and now all
Yeah.
of these things, it's like a grammar that they learn across games. It's like learning many languages or something like that. And I wonder if that also gives
Yeah.
you a trust in your sense of self and experience and intuition that you
Yeah.
wouldn't otherwise have if you didn't play more. So,
Yeah. I mean, if Lagonis is right, play is about moving between different rule sets. So the social ecosystem that would discourage reflection is one in which there was just one game and
right.
everyone's supposed to play it. And the social system that would encourage reflectiveness is a world in which you're like, hey, here's 1,000 games. Try them out, see what they're like, and then move between them and then modify them and then get dissatisfied with one and make your own. And that's again social scaffolding.
And agency, we're back to the beginning. Yeah. Thank you. Very much. I really enjoyed this conversation. And I'm telling you, I recommend you all getting the book. I think it's a really rich exploration, and there's just many, many different types of rabbit holes that I think it is relevant to. I read a lot of philosophy. I don't find a lot of it readable, but I did find this deeply, deeply readable. So I'd highly recommend you all dive in. And yeah, thank you. I don't know if anyone else has anything to finish us off, or Ty, if you want anything to say.
No, we've gone through many rabbit holes.
We have. Yeah. So thank you all for being here. It was really, really great. And hope to see you on more salons.
Thank you.